All right. Well, yes, thank you everybody. To JB's point, you did not want to listen to me try to talk last week. It was a little bit of a frog voice, and the Hayes household is quite sick, but I'm feeling a little bit better, so excited to talk with you all. And to JB's point, thank you all for kind of joining the session, and for making time out of your day. I know this is not exactly easy. So I wanted to come off camera, say hello one more time, and say those awesome jackets. Yes, sign up if you can get the form. Pretty cool jackets. I feel like I'm Vanna White at the moment. Anyway, okay. So enough of Jacob being a fool. So one of the things that I always like to do when I do sessions most recently is I like to tell a dad joke. So unfortunately, you all have to listen to a dad joke this morning, and then I will go off camera. So why couldn't the lifeguard save the hippie? He was too far out, man. All right. Now let's go into the presentation. I'm gonna stop sharing. I'm gonna start sharing my screen and go from there. Okay, not one of the better dad jokes for the day. I have a whole calendar about it. So anyways, what do we want to tackle today as a team? Well, first, I've already said thank you. You know, you guys are taking a lot of time out of your day to learn a relatively new technology, um, and trying to implement it when you're either client side or your consultancy. And it's a fun time. It's also a nervy time for all individuals who are looking at technology because it's moving a mile a minute. So thank you for joining. The other piece is I don't believe I'm going to cover forward-looking statements today, but again, please make all your decisions if you're a customer or a potential customer of Salesforce based off of technology that is currently GA or live in the market, not based off pieces on the roadmap or betas or pilots. All right, with the obligatory things out of the way, who the heck is talking to you? Yes, it's Jacob Hayes. Located just outside Maryland, or just inside Maryland, Montgomery County. We expect to have snow today, but I don't know how much. And depending on how much, Maryland usually shuts down. So we shall see. Um, One of the biggest things that I like to talk about, at least for folks who don't know me, is I have a 4-year old, and if you were on the last session that I did, she came in and wanted to interrupt and tell me all about what she was doing in coloring. So hopefully that doesn't happen again today, but if it does, life happens. So what do we want to cover? I'm going to do my best to run through all these items. And before we dive through what are the agenda topics and pieces, we're not going to be doing anything heavily technical today. So that usually gets someone to groan in a live audience. But what I want to talk through is how do we look at project success from project phases, best practices, lessons learned, etc. Because I think a lot of what has been discussed with Agentforce is great. You see a lot of videos about what's being created out in the market, what could be created, use cases, etc. But sometimes we do need to take a step back and walk through again, what are we trying to do with these projects? And who is our end state customer or goal, or what is the end state individual who we want to impact with what we're doing? So, with that being said, let's dive right in. And I think you'll even notice, I kind of set this up a little bit. My first statement, whenever someone wants to talk about Agentforce, in all honesty, any SaaS projects recently that have some agentic architecture components or predictive or generative components, is take a pause. Why? I have, like I said, I have a 4-year old at home. I get a lot of why questions throughout a day. Why is sky blue? Why is that cloud shaped like a dinosaur? I think it's sometimes interesting for us to take our approach and look through the eyes of a 4-year old back at our projects because we need to look at these 3 pillars typically when we're looking at an AI project. And you get it. I'm sure someone's looking at the slide going, thanks, Jake, for telling us the obvious. But we want to be able to plan. We want to be able to understand, do we have the right technology in place? And that's not just Salesforce. It's also technology that will relate to the use case, provide the right access to data, provide the right data, provide the right UI UX experience for the agent, etc. And then I think one that we always seem to, well, I wouldn't say always, a lot of people seem to forget is the people component. And that people component is both internal and external facing. A lot of times we're looking to build the next craziest new agent. And if your LinkedIn feeds are like mine, you see a lot of them out there on a day-to-day basis, and experts telling you all the coolest thing that they just solved hours and hours. It's great if you can create an agent that does that, but did the end state users ever use it and adopt it? Ooh, I think that's a dangerous proposition. So I want to make sure that before you jump in, you start clicking on the keys because yes, Agentforce is more simplistic to use than other technologies, you think the who, what, when, where, and why. Or if you want to go even more pragmatic, if you've seen me do presentations before for JB's community, it's the 7 Ps. So of prior proper planning. Make sure that you know each step of the way that you want to go and have the end in mind. Okay, enough of Jacob's soapbox. So, why am I starting with a circular diagram about a traditional project and its linear and patterns? Typically, and this is not for every project, projects start in a linear fashion, whether they're waterfall, they're agile, they're OODA, or hybrid constructions between those, methodologies and frameworks. Doesn't matter. We typically look at planning, building, consuming, monitoring, scaling when we look at building projects. Agentforce and agentic projects have flipped us on this head. We're now starting to think through much more iterative or constant iteration and experimentation throughout projects. If you were listening to Timo's session and others throughout this series, you'll learn that we can go live with an agent very quickly, but as you start to tweak and want to make changes to topics, to actions, expand or scale back, you realize, all right, maybe I should have taken Jacob's advice in that 7, P's of planning and say, where did we really want to start? And then how do we do micro experiments throughout the process to make sure that we can, one, fulfill the end state goal, and again, provide the right experience to the customer, the internal user, with agentic designs in an actual workflow. So typically, and I didn't do a nice little animation, so apologies, I'll do a laser pointer to talk about each one. I look at these through 5 success metrics when I look at a project. Now, again, I'm not going to be able to go through with the time that we have today, like from a project start to finish, that first KT session that you have to how do we then have it deployed and we're monitoring with a cool looking dashboard to make sure it's working correctly. But I thought, let's talk about these 5 main pieces. You've already heard me say, what's the problem statement? What specific business problem we're looking to solve? And is that business problem actually need Agentforce? I think that's a driving conversation that seems to sometimes be lost just because we have a new shiny technology that works really well. It's cool tech. Doesn't mean it has to be used in a situation, especially when we look at a crawl, walk, run model for implementation. But if we can truly understand what's our problem statement and how we're trying to address it, then we go through the typical pieces, which some of this is hopefully not too much of a repeat from Timo and the other sessions. But the idea is, again, what does the agent need access to? How do we want to gauge success? Where does it actually fit into the workflow process? A lot of times I see organizations and companies want to put Agentforce in place over a 10-step process, and it's the full 10 steps. A lot of the times it's much more interesting to say, what are the 2 or 3 steps where that agent can make my life a little bit easier? You've seen that as a starting point when we were looking at crawl use cases, I think a couple sessions ago, where it's how can that help me with the mundane tasks in a CRM instance of helping me summarize a record, augment data that's potentially missing from my records, or just help me prioritize my day. Again, that's the whole point. At least it's the whole point that I'm starting to see when people start to look at agentic designs and where it's starting to fit into their day-to-day jobs is how does it help me with my process today? And then finally, to that same people component, how are you going to clearly communicate the benefits of why you're doing this? Not only the benefits, but how it's going to help them on a day-to-day basis. Because there's a lot of skeptics still out in the market, whether right, wrong, or indifferent. Those individuals need to be won over in some capacity. And so the admins on this call, the potential developers who are working with admins and other IT groups, you need to be able to clearly articulate why this is going to be helpful for them so that they adopt. All right, those are some key activities. Project phase, best practices. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat and everything else, so feel free to type things in, or if you really have a burning question, feel free to stop me. We'll do our best to keep going. So let's look at some delivery best practices. Again, I'm going to keep it high level. I'm sure some folks probably are looking at me again, going, yeah, I got it, Jake. That's smart. But could you go a level deeper? So let me at least talk about these 4 pieces. When I look at delivery resources, when you're trying to deliver at least an Agentforce project, from a use case scope and feasibility perspective, I love a whiteboarding exercise. And if you've ever worked with me or listened to me talk, I have a whiteboard in my room right now. One of the biggest things that I've seen, at least with SaaS technologies and projects in the last, I don't know, 5 years, probably longer than that, you need to be able to visualize it in some component. And there's a little bit of framework example on the screen. More than happy to talk offline with individuals as needed. But if you can start to whiteboard out what is the process? So we're all, hopefully a lot of us are marketers in the room. We do this with journey designs, marketing cloud engagement, or within marketing cloud account engagement of what is the customer looking to do with our brand or company, and what are the micro touch points that need to happen. That design construction needs to happen in Agentforce as well when we're looking at projects. So how do we know not only the guardrails, the topics, everything that's discussed so far in this series, but where do we want to plug and play that agent? And where is it going to actually provide the most value versus where do we think it's going to provide value based off our own internal understanding? And then if you get that first whiteboarding exercise done, you get a lot of good sticky notes. You really see the pain points and the processes for the end state customer, for the internal user, then please process flow. Like, it's a tedious exercise. I'm sure the BAs are laughing on the call. But I started out as a BA. I've seen so many projects go off the rails because we don't take that next step from the use case scope and feasibility to actually saying by swim lanes, by personas, by systems, what's supposed to happen? And us going between multiple stakeholders in an organization, aligning to that process. Now, you could probably look at me and say discovery question shake. Maybe that goes ahead of the process flows, but let's just talk about it at a high level. Yeah, I think we all ask the right discovery questions, or hopefully we do when we're looking at Agentforce and projects. But I think the critical piece is really asking the right question. So Timo did a good job in his last session, I think, of showing you all best practices. Hopefully, I remember what he was talking about in my flu-ridden stupor, where he's talking about not only the business process questions, the pain points for technology, the data access needs, and all the nitty-gritties, but also, again, going that layer deeper to say, where can Agentforce actually help here? Versus, I've done this sessions many times where I get into either the third phase or we talk about items and we say, well, you just discussed and we process flowed this out, and that's actually just can be done by Apex, or that can be done by in the marketing world, I can be done by an automation that's calling from an external system, or an external system is calling into an automation. We create a couple of data extensions. We do that. We don't need an agent because it's overcomplicating the matter. And that's okay to do. I think one of the funniest things, and hopefully I don't get too many laughter pieces, is I deal with a lot of clients on a day-to-day basis. And guess what? A lot of clients are still working through how to transition from classic to lightning in the Salesforce ecosystem. Or how do I go omni-channel? And omni-channel from a standpoint of I'm just sending out batch and blast emails via Salesforce tool. How do I start to embed SMS or mobile? Or go one step further, I have a ton of custom Apex in my CRM instance. How do I transition some of that to declarative tools? That's the day to day of what's happening out in the world. Do you think some of those customers need Agentforce? I'm sure some of you are like, no, we should probably fix some of that tech debt. Agreed. So just because the shiny tool doesn't mean you have to plug it and try to square peg round a hole. So hopefully this all makes sense. And the topics, instructions, and actions, I've seen this really helpful if you just write it down. I know, again, thanks, Captain Obvious Jacob, for saying that. But by incorporating those as the templates and understanding where in the processes that you've documented, you'll start to get a better understanding of what you want to do with the project overall. And if I haven't lost the room, let's go into some lesson learns and some a little bit more interesting pieces. Okay. There's 5 additional steps. Apparently, I was in a 5-step mood when I was designing this presentation. But the lessons learned from my side are these 5 things. The first one's think backwards. Give me 1 second. I got to take a drink. Still getting over that cold. So when you think backwards, I think we've already talked about we want to look at the end in mind when we're discussing an Agentforce project. But I also think that you need to be able to understand what is that agent going to be doing in those test case scenarios. Whether if you see on my example on the screen, how are we going to split traffic via omni routing based off pre-chat fields? Or how do we know when the right escalation moment happens when the agent is asked a question that he can't do, but the customer expects them to do so? So you need to be able to think through those use cases and not only end in mind, but be able to say, how are the different test case scenarios going to play out if I can put myself in the agent's shoes? And I think we talked about this a couple sessions ago as well, is I see agents and especially agents in the next 6 to 8 months starting to become, the junior level employees in an organization. Junior level employees are the great ones, in my opinion. They need to be melded, they need to be molded, they need to be taught how things are done, but they also need to be taught things in the right manner. Again, go back to the 4-year-old's perspective. In my household, I have to be able to teach her to do things. And I think that's where agents are at this exact moment. Whether they get fully autonomous or not, we can have another finally conversation there. So think backwards and then start simple. I get it. Everyone wants to try to do the complex scenario and the crawl, walk, run model. Everyone wants to go walk or run. But I do think if you can start simple with your topics and in minimal instructions and then iteratively build there, it's great. Now you might be looking, Jake, didn't you just say earlier in this presentation that iteratively building is difficult? Yes and no. I think if you start small enough and you guardrail what you want an agent to do, that's where you can start having multiple agents do different things and working together. But again, it's on a use case by use case basis. Now, the do's and don'ts sections, we'll go a lot more into depth in those in a couple slides in a few minutes. But in the do's section, I mean, key terms, talking and clarifying your statements. Again, and I'm sorry that I'm going to keep bringing up the 4-year-old. If I tell my 4-year-old to do something, but I am not explicit, she's not going to do it. Or she's going to get me something and I'm going to look at her like, why did you grab that juice box? I asked you to grab a pouch. You need to be able to be very explicit and use less fluffy words and other pieces as you're starting to work with your instructions. Talk to it like it's a 4-year-old. And the instructions or in the don't section, avoid fixating on formatting. I do this all the time. I really want the format to come back in an exact manner because I'm a perfectionist. But sometimes you just need to understand, did it at least provide the response back in a manner that is acceptable? And then start to work through either sensitive business rules or other pieces behind it. And then please avoid vague conditions. I do it all the time. I need to practice what I would preach here. But after that, be much more explicit on what that means. And I have a couple slides on that. And then finally, you're going to get to a point where you're stuck. So scale back. I think this example that I had was there was a potential customer that I had where they were looking at 10 plus instructions and there was just no way to try to claw back the construction and design. So at some point you're going to need to look at and go, when do I just start over? Or when do I claw back as much as I can to at least get the output that I would expect on a, rolling basis, etc. So these are these high level. To go a step further, when we're looking at building topics, I've color coded classification descriptions, scope, and instructions. A lot of words on the screen. Probably should have written it a little bit better. But when we look at classification description, that top section, you need to imagine the agent can only read the description and it must use it to figure out the current conversation. What do I mean by that? To the point before, be explicit. And that classification description is actually quite important to help the agent understand what's going on. The scope section, think of it the same way. What if they can only read that? I think I made a typo error there. In the scope section, imagine they can only read the scope and then decide what they're able to do or not do. And then the instructions section, the same thing. What if they can only read the instructions section with some context from the scope and escalation and how to apply it? If you look at the format, and hopefully I explained that well, if I didn't, apologies. If you can look at it, this construction and the building blocks matter this way, you'll start to realize their agents will perform a little bit better. But it is a nuanced technique of how you talk and build these within your instances. Okay, common mistakes. So on this left-hand side, you'll see 5 examples. I'm actually not going to talk about them because I have slides for each one. And they're high level, but hopefully it helps folks, avoid some pitfalls as you're working into the projects or going live with your first agent and a customer, etc. The takeaway section, I think one of the biggest pieces, and I won't belabor reading it all at you, is we've already talked about specificity. We've already talked about, providing the context and the relationships, which if you haven't done a course on, effective prompting, then there's a ton of them out in the market. There's a couple of good ones on Pluralsight and other sources. I would recommend going through it because it is a little bit of, an art rather than a science of how to prompt correctly and then how to tweak your prompts back and forth. I'm sure all of you have tried to do it with GPT, Anthropic, or, Gronk and say, I asked my question. I really think the response is going to be great. How do I tweak it? Because they actually responded terribly, or it didn't provide me any of what I was looking for. Hint, hint, I had that happen yesterday. Break down your tasks, precise language, and define output. All critical pieces. So let's start with number one. Ambiguous or vague prompts. I get it. A lot of us want to be able to talk to an agent or create our instructions in natural language in a simplistic manner. But we do forget, and hint, hint, I'm one of those guys who forgets, specificity is king. So instead of us going, and this is a really bad example, but it's just one that came up with, is instead of saying, tell me about a book, why don't we be specific about it? Provide our detailed summary, the name of the book, include key elements of the main characters and plots. Now, how does this fit into a potential use case? Well, if I'm looking to reference specific data that's either housed in Data Cloud or specifically in a different object, knowledge articles or an embedded custom object within CRM, I want to be able to explicitly call to that object and those fields. And I hope you as a proper admin have put together a lot of good documentation of descriptions in those fields as well, because it's critical for the agent to understand the context of why you're pointing them to that field. And hopefully the content in that field is structured in a manner that looks great. And if it's unstructured, there's obviously different systems and technologies that we've talked through in the past. But you can see where I'm going with it by, going down the rabbit hole. It makes your life easier as you build out your prompts and your custom prompt templates and your actions if you're less ambiguous. So then lack of context. In this specific example is, at least I have yet to do this, but I have seen this out in the market where people go, give me a few ideas for marketing strategy. That's too broad. Provide additional context. Why are you looking for that? I think the chief example here is where Marketing Cloud Engagement has released, its first iterations of generative AI for body content, subject line content, etc. I watched a lot of individuals be very broad for the first piece, so ambiguous, but also not provide the context of what your company is, what your brand's looking to do. What are you trying to reach to that customer in your message? If you can be more strategic and be more explicit without making your prompt the longest thing in the world, you're going to provide some very interesting responses back. I saw a question in the chat. No framing. Yes. So I think we're going to continue going through the real life examples, but we can also take that one in the Q&A section at the end. All right, too many tasks in one prompt, what we call overloading. Yeah, there was a good question, I think, in I don't know how many different sessions that I've had the last month or so, which is like, how many topics are enough? How many instructions should you be putting in an agent? And hint, hint, and again, this is just Jacob, so I'm not speaking for anybody else. It's a lot of, I don't know, you're going to have to tweak and iterate. So what does that mean? It means you're going to have to look at how many tasks do I want the agent to do? Oh, I never get precise. Good question. Sorry, I looked at the chat. You need to be precise, but you also need to be able to say, am I providing too many tasks for the agent to do? You wouldn't overload an individual with 5 or 7 different tasks back to back to back and expect them to do it immediately. So don't treat an agent that way. Jacob's trying to look at like iRobot in the future. Be nice to your AI agents, folks. You never know when they're going to become autonomous. Just kidding. Bad dad joke again. But anyways, when we go back to this, so if we can say in our example is summarize an article and tell me how it relates to our sales strategy, why don't we give it like first summarize, then explain, and walk through that pattern construction the same way that we talk to Claude or GPT when we're working through our own brainstorming sessions. Work on that as a potential prompting technique in the future. Imprecise questions and instructions. Yeah, I get it. I kind of hinted on this before. Be precise. So instead of saying, what should we do to improve customer satisfaction? Why don't we say, what customer service improvements can we implement to reduce response time and increase satisfaction? And even as I read my own example, that's not explicit enough for me. I think you should go a couple layers deeper and see what the response comes back in your prompts. I'm going to take that question that came through in the Q&A section because it's a good one. So no defined output format. Similar to what we were talking about before, you get stuck on formatting and formatting the right way it should respond back to the customer. You should also think through how do you want the agent to provide the response back. Now, you don't need to go into explicit details on, what is the right CSS or HTML construction it should do if it's an email content that it's supposed to be providing back. You could. I have seen people go down those rabbit holes, but I think if you can start at a very high level, you can then iterate and see where to go from there. Again, Jacobs, hopefully it comes across. Iteration is key, but also this is a natural language tool that you should be able to look at and say, all right, that makes sense to me when I wrote it out? If not, we should try again. I think that was the last one in this section. So there is a good question in the chat that we're going to take in the Q&A, which aligns to license costs. And should we try to club multiple tasks at one prompt or workarounds? I really want to cover that one in the Q&A because I think that's a good one. So please keep asking the questions. We'll do a good, robust Q&A soon. Okay. If you joined any session that Jacob has done in the past, and yes, if your bingo board is out, I did talk about myself in the third person, so shame on me. But if you look at how to approach an Agentforce use case, I've done similar conversations on how to approach a use case from a marketing perspective, from a data cloud perspective, etc. And I love to bring in the scientific method. I love science. I think the scientific method is the right approach to look at a problem statement, your hypothesis with your problems, your questioning. What do you think from your experimentation? Did it meet your conclusion? If it didn't, we start again. But if we bring that into our world, I like to align it to, from the hypothesis perspective, yes, what's our clear objective? We've talked about that before. But what's our problem statement and how do we want to test it? What requirements are needed? What existing workflows or systems do I need to integrate with? These are all items that are critical to outline. UI, UX, and CX. The reason why I've mentioned this again is I have seen this be missed in a lot of Agentforce conversations and projects. Is not only where should the agent be interplaying with the internal or external customer or internal individual who's using the platform, but also what is it supposed to show? There's going to be a case soon when we start getting, the next couple layers of Agentforce deeper, or next couple of iterations of Agentforce, that we'll start getting into much more multimodal conversations and agents, orchestrating agents, which if you've seen GPT's orchestrator, you see where this is potentially going. But we do need to harken back to this UI UX piece. If it's an internal facing agent, does that need to be a quick action that is defined and someone clicks the action and they get their item? Does it need to be the pop-out? Does it need to be embedded as a custom workflow? And workflow, not the technology term, but workflow in the process of, I have screen flows being built in CRM, and one button click here allows me to then go and interject additional data from GPT to, again, alleviate the admin responsibilities as a CRM user. Just an example, top of mind, but these are the things you need to be thinking through. Talked about experimentation enough. I don't need to beat a dead horse. Capabilities, what should it do? How should it integrate with other processes? The reason why I love talking about this one is I have a lot of different conversations in enterprise organizations where Agentforce isn't the only thing in play. And there's a lot of different AI tools being done by enterprise technologies or other startups. And clients are looking at saying, how can I start a process in, I don't know, take an example of Adobe Workflow or Workfront or There's potentially Tray.io. I think I said that one right. Anyways, there's potentially other systems where there's a process being handled by an agent. How can I trigger at a certain moment in time when that agent has helped complete a workflow in another system to trigger something in Salesforce? So how can we get the agents and agents talking to one another? Which Salesforce, I think it's very close to releasing the Agentforce APIs. This is where this is going to get very interesting. And we need to think through what are those capabilities, how it fits into the process and the integrations on that front. And then finally, excuse me, I've talked about this many times. If you can't measure an outcome or measure your use case, it's not a use case. It's not something you should tackle. It comes under even more scrutiny with Agentforce, and there's a measurement section that we'll do here because of, unfortunately, the ambiguity of pricing structures and license structures, which I think we talked a little bit about in the Ask Me Anything section. It shouldn't make you shy away from it, but it should make you cautious in how are we going to pick the right use case and be able to measure that it provides value back to either our customer or my client if you're a consultancy. That's critical. And that hasn't changed regardless of the technology we've been implementing for years. Can't measure it, don't do it. All right, so let's put it into perspective with a couple perspective use cases. Now, I threw these together the other day with a lot of Dayquil probably in my head. So they might not be the best use cases, and someone might look at me and go, I have a much better one. That's great. I'm not saying I'm the expert here. They're just ideas. But why did I say that? Because I've thought through some high level account balance and transaction inquiry where an agent could assist, potentially some fraud alert and dispute assistance, not down to the very granular level, but there's some interesting things that I've seen of what Agentforce can help handle with fraud. And then order status and tracking assistant, and this is a crawl one, but a lot of interesting things. So if you look at, and I'm not going to read it all to you because hopefully you guys will take a screenshot or think through how you would inject this into your own construction. Start with your problem statement, start with your data sources, and try to have your end in mind with your goal, with an overarching statement at the bottom of each square or rectangle or whatever you want to call it that says, this is why we think this will be helpful, because it helps us with X process or X outcome. All right, hopefully that makes sense. Now, there's a couple of questions. Well, there was one other good comment in there. I'll get to it in the Q&A. Now, my favorite is how to measure success. Okay, so critical to Agentforce success, obviously, is measuring. And the definition, you'll let you guys read it on the side. I always like to start with the definition of what I mean by something and then go into the granular details. For me, the examples on this right-hand side of the screen are more important. I think we need to look at success in a couple of different capabilities in 4 bullets, which is how is our model performing? What's its accuracy? How well is it doing with recall? F1 scores, if you don't know what F1 scores, I'll provide a link in the chat on what do we look at for F1 scores to assess the model effectiveness. From a user adoption and engagement perspective, how will you know it's adopted and being used? There's a lot of good things coming down the roadmap with Agentforce between Tableau dashboards and dashboards in general on effectiveness and use. But until those things come live, how will you make sure that you are understanding the right measurement success rates and how people are actually using your agent? Operational efficiency, I think I've hit that one. And then business impact. Is it actually aligning to a business goal or an enterprise goal for your customer or for you as your client or the brand that you work for? All right, so let's go a level deeper. Let's look at an example for service. So I think an agentic service agent, I don't know if that's actually a good word to say, but bear with me as I take a drink of coffee. If we look at the different categories and KPIs for a service use case or a service agent, we typically look at what's the engagement, what's its performance, and what are the outcomes. And those user engagement is how many specific help portal sessions or total conversations or abandonment rate. You can see we're trying to get to a granular level of what can I measure to show me that the agent is helping me and providing value because I'm paying for this. Then how are agents performing? What's the latency? What's the time to resolve? What's the check quality score? A lot of things that we do with Service Cloud implementations or helping with Service Center transformations. But now we're looking at the agent being the individual instead of the customer support individual with a license seat, looking at these response times or how to resolve our resolutions. And then finally, with outcomes, I look at it in these three. There's probably another 10 you can put there, but does the customer actually like it? And are they using it and they feel good about it? So I'm going to do something interesting, which is we think we've all seen, I'll lay some context on this slide for a second. Salesforce rolled out Agentforce on help and training. It's also started to roll it out in partner communities. If you haven't seen that, it's in beta. Salesforce loves to talk about, and I like the slide and how they report success and how they reporting success by week, by specific Agentforce sessions or those KPIs we just talked about, as well as how did it compare to its humans. Now, there's still some pieces that are to be determined. Obviously, I don't work for Salesforce, but I thought this was a very interesting one to at least outline the construction. And regardless of what you think about Agentforce on help and training, look at this from the lens of what are the total number of sessions? I'll get my laser pointer back out. How did they measure sessions? How did they measure their conversion rates? And how did they look at latency? And you can see that they actually started to, provide good resolution rates. Now, for me as an individual who always is inquisitive, was that resolution rate just people clicking out because they didn't get the answer they wanted? Or was it actually providing support? And then where was the support categories or chunkings underneath it? If it resolved now 85 to 85% here, was those simple questions related to my license structure, etc. Again, you guys can put your own thought processes or thinking caps on here. But by being able to show in a time frame by KPI perspective, this will allow individuals to hopefully look at and say, oh, good, Agentforce is doing what I expected to do. So think through those KPIs, think through how you're going to actually collect that information and portray it back to your stakeholders or your bosses internally. All right. I also wanted to throw up the 6 things that Salesforce has said that is critical from their own learnings here. The reason why I want to show it is I think a lot of these we all say intuitively, duh, I get that. Agents need content. Yeah, in a customer service perspective, 100%. We need to know the right knowledge components. That's why we talked about it with Chris, with Timo, and others throughout these whole sessions. It's always backed by humans or human intervention. I get it. One experience with many agents, fantastic. Invest in ongoing tooling. There's a reason why I'm reading this to you, and hopefully you guys get it, is Salesforce is at the forefront of their own technology, but they're thinking the same way that you and I are thinking, hopefully, when we look at an Agentforce project. What content do we need? What's the right data? How do we interplay it with the human individuals? If it can provide incremental self-service resolution, we provide value, which aligns to a KPI and a measurement goal, etc. So again, hopefully that makes sense and why I dedicated a whole subsection into measurement in this process. All right. This is where usually people tune out. So I want to talk about the COE, or a Center of Excellence model. And usually people look at me and go, oh, Jacob, do we have to talk about Center of Excellence? Yes. If we're talking about people and we're talking about governance structures, especially with AI, I think it's vitally important. And this is what I think of, and I think it's a mixture of the Salesforce components and my own opinions of what is governance between functions, actions, people, and vision. And if you put an Agentforce lens on it, so what are the functions? So those AI model optimization reviews, the actions, which could be weekly in board forums, and the people, the individuals who are working with this on a day-to-day basis, and how are they governing the platform and the solution to maintain your vision. And your vision is your own company or brand's vision. My example here is to establish and uphold scalable, ethical, and high-performing AI models. Yours could be completely different. But I do believe starting and writing this down and then putting the right individuals in place. It's not the best image in the world, so I'll get a better one the next time. But if you put the right individuals in place, either from a hierarchical model or from maybe a two in the box model or other, project management constructions, you're going to start seeing your projects be more successful, and you're going to start injecting a lot more frameworks that will provide success for your own internal organization, for your own internal teams, etc. I'm cognizant of time at the moment, so I'm rushing through a little bit, but hopefully this is making sense. And then I did want to walk through the next layer deeper of a COE model, which is how do I look at phase rollouts? The time frames and the activities can be different when we look at COEs. It doesn't have to be 3 months, 6 months, or 6 plus. It could be any time frame, depending on what you're looking at. But I do think that the critical component, which is why I'm showing it, is that people and process item is just as valuable as the data and the technology pieces if you look at the four main pillars of a project success. And so keep this in mind as you're working through your projects. It's very interesting to get into the tool and start building something, but start to think through how are we going to deliver these and then deliver iteratively throughout the next 6, 9, 12 months. That's the best way to get success from any sort of product or platform. And then there's some other key steps to drive COE value. I'll let you guys read this. And then I think, JB, we might be sharing this presentation after the fact, but we'll let you guys read how we look at rapid delivery, strategic alignment, governance frameworks, etc. And what does that actually value does it provide? And then finally, I wanted to show you guys one little framework that I can't take credit for this. This is a really good one from the CSG group at Salesforce. I have a similar one for marketing focused COEs as well as data focused COEs. So I love that they went down the people, business, technology, and data, as well as how these can start to help you categorize and write out your AI guardrails for your use cases. So what do I mean by that? So the guardrails framework, the idea is we're looking at different familiar areas, whether that's tech, the application of the value and risk, and aligning it to our use case analysis, as well as our company specific goals. You can see this is all building on one another. So if we understand this construction, this framework as we have a use case, we have our potential risk areas, which could be people, business, technology, or data. You can feel free to rip that apart or rip it to shreds and do what you think. Then between the risk area, what's the specific concern that we think is going to happen with our use case? What's the mitigation area, which typically they align between risk and mitigation? And then how are we looking at what specific guardrail or mitigation step could we interject and put in place for our use case to make sure that security and governance, as well as your compliance teams, will sign off on the AI project? So here's an example. If you take I think one of the order status agents or even the tracking fulfillment agent that we talked about before, here's an example. If we look at that agent and there's a potential risk area with people, and if you follow my little arrows, there's a potential concern where a customer's user interface expectations and understandings are not met. So how could we mitigate that between people and the tech? Between the people, we could work with some experts or subject matter expertise internally at our organization to say, who are the best customer service representatives we have? How do they communicate with the language and the tone to the customer? How can we embed their learnings into our order status agent? Then from a technology perspective, how could we help with displaying the agent's interface or displaying a clear messaging and using maybe APIs and construction to call directly to our status system or a transaction system, etc., so that we know the response back is driven in, or sorry, that's not the right way I would say it. We know that the response back is embedded in our exact zero-party data about our customer, so there shouldn't be hallucination. And then finally, from a technology perspective, is if you can provide clear and easy ways for that human to say, as they're talking to the agent, I want to talk to someone in person, which I think we've all been on call trees or chats where we say representative. So you have to be able to think through that next phase to say, how can I have the person who is extremely pissed about an order, not have to deal with my agent, and let's get them directly to a human to resolve this quickly so they become hopefully a brand loyalist or a brand follower in the future and we don't lose them in the organization. All right, so I rushed through that last piece really quickly, but I like the frameworks. I think they're interesting. Feel free to tweak them to your own heart's desire. But now I did leave at least 10 minutes for Q&A. So let's go back to the chat. Okay, so I think the first one I was looking at was, I know framing a good prompt is always helpful in getting grounded answers. Can you share some tips that you use in real life for generating good prompts? You're going to laugh at my answer here. Let's work smart, not harder. I have actually started to use different other agents to help refine my prompts. So we write out a prompt. I then provide it back to, I don't know, pick a LLM or a model of your choice and say tweak it. Now you probably would go much more specific with the instructions back instead of just saying tweak it. But to have that iterative person with you, and that person is literally the LLM or the model itself, it does refine down to a better prompting structure, and I've seen it work pretty well. The second question I saw was, since we have a license cost associated with prompts, should we try to club multiple tasks in one prompt or workarounds to save on cost? Whew. So the reason why I wanted to save this is the one where I actually don't have a silver bullet answer for the group, and I'm sure someone else out there might have a different response. I have seen this go both ways. I have seen individuals say, jam as much in to one specific area within either the topics or the instructions or within a massive custom prompt to get what you need. You basically force it. It's worked, but one of the biggest pieces that I talk about there is the more complex your prompt, the more potential latency that will occur for the time the question is asked to the response back, as well as the more potential integrations you're going to need in that custom prompt to call to all of the right data sources or provide the right context for the LLM to handle the right response back to you. Hopefully that makes sense. So no right or wrong answer there, but very good question. And if there's anyone else who wants to chat or put that through into a response to the individual, feel free to do so. Let me read this next one. That's a good tip and trick, Shamala. Hopefully I said your name right. And there's no other questions. So if anybody else has a thought process or a question, feel free to come off mute. No such thing as a bad question. So any ideas, thoughts? JB, you see anything?
Thank you very much, Jacob. This is very insightful session, and I see from the comments as well, this is very informational. Thanks for putting this together. And thanks for covering all the questions as well. I think we covered almost all the questions that are in here. Everyone, if you have any other questions, please post them. This is going to be the last session. So any questions, we have a few more minutes to take those questions. Sharing the presentation. When you find the video uploaded in the description area, you will find the link to the presentations as well.
Do we know if multiple internal agents are on the roadmap? I knew someone would ask the question, JB. So I'm glad I put the forward-looking statement slide in. Yes, it's on the roadmap. Do I know when it's coming? No idea. And I'm sorry for being tongue-in-cheek there, but it is at least the vision of what I understand from product at Agentforce and at Salesforce. I just don't know when that's going to be the case. But I do think whenever the Agentforce APIs get released, which I'm hoping in the next month or so, but don't quote me on the time frame, that's going to be your first starting point into having multimodal agents and multiple agents being able to work together with one another. So keep that in the back of your mind and also be watching for release notes on that specific piece. But good question, Jennifer. Sorry, I don't have a good direct answer for you.
Is Agentforce supporting voice?
Voice chat. Yeah, another very good question. Again, I believe it's on the roadmap. But this is where I have seen, and I can't give away too many hints and things from my time at Accenture, We are seeing this be front and center with a lot of our ideas and use cases around generative AI across any tooling set. But we have started to see we can use voice chat, whether it's the embedded technology of Agentforce or we're working around via other methods to do it. I can't tell you exactly. You can see why I'm fumbling on my words at the moment. But there are ways to do it. It's interesting. It's on the roadmap. That'll be really fun when it comes out, at least in my opinion. But I'm a nerd. Uh, Now they're flowing through. See one from Julie. Any updates on getting a more robust version of Agentforce Business Value Calculator for partners? Ooh, Julie, another good one. I don't have an answer to that one. I hope that's the case. Uh, I have started internally building out calculators or business value constructions here at Accenture, and I know there's other individuals that have done it as well. Uh, but I don't think there's anything on that I've heard of, and I could be out of the loop here on something for partners.
There's one question about the Slack channel integration. Can we
Ooh,
integrate
yeah,
Agentforce with the Slack? I think there is.
there is. So there is integrations with Agentforce into Slack. Go, since we're running out of time, if you have a chance, go look at the Agentforce Decoded YouTube series. They've shown an example of Slack and they've shown an example of Teams, and both are looking at the Agentforce APIs. Intent, that's why I keep talking about it. But you should be able to find some interesting details on how that works. So hopefully that answers that question.
How do you think generative canvas is going to impact the process modeling as the user experience is going to be a key factor for adoption?
What a great question. I don't have an answer to that. I'd have to take that one offline. I'm always wondering whenever I do this session, who is going to be the person in the room who's like 10 times smarter than me and is going to ask the question that I have no idea how to answer. You have just won that award, individual. So I don't know. That would something I would take offline, or maybe we can have a further discussion there.
And there's one question about the last slide that you shared about the framework. Does it categorize risk areas and why is this classification important?
Yeah. So let's go back. If you're talking about the mitigation and specific guardrails, or if you want to come offline and ask the question, just want to make sure I answer it correctly.
So I'm gonna grant access to everyone to unmute themselves. So feel free to unmute and add more details to that. And Jacob, as you mentioned for this one, we can take it offline.
Yeah.
And can you share your LinkedIn handle as well? So
Yeah, I
you
can share that.
can, yeah, anyone can connect on the Slack channel as well. If you are part of the Slack channel, Jacob checks the messages there. You can post your questions on the Slack channel as well.
Yep. All right. Let me look at one more question. I'm running through all the stuff. There's another one from Emma on multi-internal agent threads. Would there be a capability to self-select an agent based off record page context, i.e. account object defaults first to open the account agent? When you're building out your agent, it does take, and goes back to some of our legacy Copilot pieces that we were building out a year or so ago, if not less. It's supposed to default to your context of where you're asking the specific question, but you can also build into that context, I think, for what you're asking, Emma, into the prompts itself within your agent. So if you only wanted to return back a set number of records or cases, etc., you're going to have to be able to contextually tell it in the prompt what records to select. And this is where the visibility and construction of what the agent is able to look at and how it's looking at information, depending on your license structure, is critical. But there should be ways to be able to look at that component. Sorry if that didn't answer your question directly, but I have seen it done internally. And I think with that, it's the last question we can get to, JB. I'm going to keep us on time.
Yes, Jacob. So I think we covered all the questions here. Thank you very much, Jacob.
Yeah. So
I
I guess
think
one last thing, JB, before we end. Thank you all.
Mhm.
I think that thank you, JB. Thank you, Gilda. If Gilda's still here on this first session series with everyone, I think it was really insightful, even for me, to learn some cool stuff from Timo and the team who have presented. Shameless plug again to what JB was talking about. Please look at the next upcoming sessions and join, as well as ask questions out in the community. But I really appreciate all the time and the interest areas from this group, and look forward to talking with you more on other digital channels. All right, JB, back to you.
thank you, Jacob, and thanks everyone for continuing this journey with us. So this has been an amazing series. We learned a lot, including me. I learned a lot of new things from this each and every session from all the speakers that we have here. We hope you gained a lot of information from these sessions, and we hope to continue the same journey with you with the next series. So we're going to publish the sessions soon, and please watch out for those sessions and register. So I'm going to turn off the recording now. We will check the